My daughter stole my identity to get a $900,000 loan and buy a mansion for her in-laws. At their lavish housewarming party, her husband had the audacity to ask me, "How did you get here?" I just smiled and pointed to the sheriff's deputy walking in behind my lawyer. His face went pale when he realized I wasn't there to celebrate their new home. I was there to legally seize it. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Cynthia Coleman. For 40 years, my world was a universe of numbers, a quiet, orderly cosmos governed by the immutable laws of the tax code. As a senior auditor for the Internal Revenue Service, I was a financial detective, a woman trained to find the truth hidden in the dense, tangled forests of other people's lives. My job was to follow the money, and I learned that money, more than any poet, tells the truest stories. At 66, my life is now one of quiet, well-earned peace. I am a recent widow, living in the beautiful historic brownstone in Hyde Park that my late husband and I paid for with a lifetime of disciplined, unflashy work. My life is a balanced ledger. My assets are secure, my debts are zero, and my heart, though grieving, is at peace. This quiet, solvent life is, however, a source of profound irritation to my only child, Jasmine. Jasmine lives in a different universe. She is a luxury brand consultant, a profession that seems to consist of advising wealthy people on which expensive things to buy to best project the image of being a wealthy person. She is married to a man named Marcus Hayes, a partner at a top consulting firm, and they live in a world of performative, debt-fueled success. To Jasmine, my life of quiet, intellectual comfort is not a sign of success. It is a sign of failure. It is a failure of ambition, a failure of imagination. She will visit my home, her eyes sweeping over my comfortable, book-filled rooms with a look of pitying condescension. "Mother, this house has such potential," she'll say, "but it's so academic. We could really open it up, modernize it. It would be a fantastic investment property." She does not see a home. She sees an asset. She does not see a mother. She sees an obstacle, a quiet, stubborn woman living in the middle of her future inheritance. She has no idea that the woman who spent 40 years auditing the complex finances of millionaires and corporations is more than capable of auditing the simple, ugly balance sheet of her own daughter's character. And she has no idea that the final, devastating audit is about to begin. Jasmine's ambition was a hungry, insatiable thing, and its primary focus was the Hayes family. My son-in-law, Marcus, came from a family that was a pillar of North Shore society, the kind of old-money, Protestant establishment that looked down on anyone whose wealth was less than 3 generations deep. They lived in a sprawling, Gatsby-esque estate in Winnetka, a world of manicured lawns, quiet privilege, and a profound, unspoken judgment of anyone deemed new money, or even worse, no money. Jasmine, the daughter of a plumber and an IRS auditor from Hyde Park, was desperate to belong. She had spent her entire marriage in a frantic, exhausting performance, trying to prove that she was one of them. She had adopted their accent, their hobbies, their politics. She had thrown lavish parties she and Marcus couldn't afford, their credit card debt a secret, ticking time bomb beneath the polished floors of their own heavily mortgaged home. But it was never enough. To the Hayes family, she was still an outsider, a charming but ultimately déclassé addition to their bloodline. And Jasmine, in her deep, gnawing insecurity, decided she needed to make one grand, undeniable gesture, a move so audacious it would permanently cement her place in the family dynasty. The plan, which she unveiled to Marcus one evening in a torrent of desperate, ambitious energy, was breathtaking in its sheer, unmitigated gall. Marcus's parents were getting older. Their massive Winnetka estate was becoming too much for them. Jasmine's idea was this. They, Jasmine and Marcus, would buy a new, smaller, but equally luxurious mansion in Winnetka for the elder Hayeses. It would be a gift. An incredible multi-million-dollar act of filial devotion that would be the talk of the North Shore for a generation. It would, of course, also indebt them to Marcus's parents for the rest of their lives, creating a bond of gratitude so profound it would be tantamount to ownership. It was a brilliant and deeply sociopathic power move. There was only one problem. They didn't have the money. Their own finances were a carefully constructed house of cards. A multi-million-dollar real estate purchase was an impossibility. And that is when Jasmine's desperate, ambitious gaze turned south, to the quiet, unassuming brownstone in Hyde Park, and to the quiet, unassuming mother whose impeccable financial history was about to become the unwilling key to her daughter's grand criminal scheme. The execution of the crime was a masterpiece of cold, calculated betrayal. Jasmine came to my house a week later, under the pretense of helping me sort through some of my late husband's old papers. It was a performance of daughterly concern, an act of loving support that was, in reality, a reconnaissance mission. While I was in the kitchen making us tea, she was in my home office, her movements swift and silent. She knew exactly what she was looking for. My life as an auditor was a life of meticulous records. She found my file of personal documents, my birth certificate, my social security card, a copy of my last tax return, a recent bank statement. She took out her phone and with a steady hand she photographed every single one. She then replaced the file, leaving no trace of her intrusion. That evening, the second phase of her operation began. Using the information she had stolen, she went online. She created a new secret email address in my name, a simple, plausible address that a woman of my age might choose. This would be her digital ghost, the account through which she would intercept all communication from the bank. Then she applied for the mortgage. It was for $900,000. She applied not to a small local bank but to a large, impersonal national mortgage corporation, a faceless entity that dealt in algorithms and credit scores, not in personal relationships. She filled out the online application with my information. My name, my address, my social security number. She listed my assets, my income from my pension and investments, all the information she had gleaned from my stolen documents. And then she came to the signature line. With a few deft clicks of a mouse, she uploaded a scan of my signature from an old letter she had saved, and she digitally and criminally signed my name. The loan application was a work of art, a perfect, fraudulent portrait of a recently widowed, financially stable 66-year-old woman with an impeccable credit history seeking a mortgage to purchase a new home for her family. It was plausible. It was logical. And it was approved in less than a week. The entire transaction from the application to the closing was conducted digitally. All communication from the bank, the requests for more information, the approval notice, the closing documents, went to the secret email address she had created. I, the real Cynthia Coleman, was completely and blissfully unaware that my good name, my lifetime of financial integrity, was being used to secure a nearly $1 million loan for a house I had never seen, for a purpose I could never have imagined. The crime was perfect. It was seamless. And it was, she believed, completely untraceable. For a few weeks, Jasmine's perfect crime remained perfect. The loan was approved. The house in Winnetka was purchased. The deed was in her and Marcus's name. The mortgage, however, the massive $900,000 debt, was solely and secretly in mine. She had succeeded. She had pulled off the most audacious social and financial coup of her life. But even the most perfect crime is vulnerable to the one thing no criminal can ever control: human error. A small, simple, and deeply ironic mistake in the vast, impersonal bureaucracy of the mortgage company. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, a single, innocuous-looking envelope in my daily mail. It was not a bill. It was not a statement. It was a piece of junk mail, a glossy, promotional flyer from the mortgage company's marketing department. The kind of thing most people would toss into the recycling bin without a second glance. But I am not most people. I am a retired IRS auditor. I do not throw away financial documents, no matter how insignificant they may seem. I opened the envelope. The flyer was a cheerful, brightly colored piece of corporate propaganda. At the top, in a large, friendly font, it read, "Welcome to the First National Mortgage Family, Cynthia Coleman." I stared at the words, a cold, prickling sensation spreading across the back of my neck. First National Mortgage? I had never done business with them in my life. My own brownstone had been paid off for 20 years. I continued to read. The flyer was full of useless information about online bill pay and refinancing options. But at the bottom, in small, almost unreadable print, was the detail that made my heart stop. It was a reference number. Loan #78B4992, for the property at 1450 Sheridan Road, Winnetka, Illinois. Winnetka. The address was a punch to the gut. It was the exclusive, wealthy suburb where the Hayes family lived, the world my daughter was so desperate to conquer. I stood in my quiet, sun-drenched kitchen, the glossy flyer in my hand, and the pieces of a horrifying, unbelievable puzzle began to snap into place. The sudden, urgent need for my personal documents. The strange, secretive conversations I had sometimes overheard. The new, triumphant and deeply unsettling confidence my daughter had been radiating for the past few weeks. My initial reaction was not anger. It was a deep, profound, and almost academic sense of disbelief. The sheer scale of the deception, the cold, calculated nature of the betrayal. It was a crime of such profound and intimate cruelty that my mind at first refused to accept it. But I am a woman who has been trained to trust the documents. And the document in my hand, as flimsy and as unimportant as it was telling me a story. A story of a massive $900,000 fraud. A story of a daughter who had not just betrayed her mother, but had used her mother's good name to steal a fortune. The shock, however, was a fleeting thing. It was quickly replaced by something else. A familiar and deeply empowering feeling. It was the feeling I used to get at the beginning of a major audit, the quiet, thrilling hum of a complex case beginning to unfold. I was no longer a grieving mother. I was an auditor. And I had just been handed my next case file. My first and only call was to Charles Dubois. Charles was more than just my lawyer, he was a part of the architecture of my life. He had been my late husband's best friend, a man whose integrity was as solid and as unshakable as the granite columns of the courthouse downtown. He was a formidable fraud and litigation attorney, a man who took a quiet, righteous pleasure in dismantling the lives of the arrogant and the corrupt. I did not call him in a panic. I scheduled a formal appointment. I arrived at his office in the Loop the next morning, not as a hysterical victim but as a client. I placed the glossy promotional flyer on his large, polished desk. "Charles," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I believe my daughter has committed bank fraud." He listened in a grim, silent fury as I laid out my suspicions. He looked at the flyer. He looked at the loan number. He looked at the Winnetka address. He did not doubt me for a second. "The arrogant little fool," he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She really did it." Our investigation was a quiet, methodical, and deeply professional affair. We did not confront Jasmine. We did not alert the authorities. That would come later. First, we needed to build our case. We needed to gather the irrefutable documentary proof. Charles, with his legal authority, began the process. He filed a formal inquiry with the mortgage company, under the guise of a routine identity theft check on my behalf. He subpoenaed the entire loan application file. A week later, a thick, heavy box of documents arrived at his office. We sat together in his boardroom and we went through it page by damning page. It was all there. The online application filled out with my stolen information. The forged digital signatures. The secret email address that had been used to communicate with the bank. The closing documents for the $1.5 million house in Winnetka. A house that was now legally owned by Jasmine and Marcus, but was secured by a $900,000 debt that was legally and solely in my name. The paper trail was a monument to my daughter's audacity, and to her profound and catastrophic foolishness. She had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs that a first-year law student could have followed. "We have her, Cynthia," Charles said, his voice a quiet, triumphant thing. "Cold. She's facing a federal indictment. Bank fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft. She could go to prison for a very, very long time." The thought of my own daughter in prison sent a wave of nausea through me. But the thought of what she had been willing to do to me, the cold, calculated nature of her betrayal, was even more sickening. "What do we do now?" I asked. "Now," Charles said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face, "we do nothing. We let her believe she has gotten away with it. We let her move into her grand new house. We let her plan her triumphant housewarming party. We let her climb to the very top of her mountain of lies. And then, at the moment of her greatest triumph, we are going to present her with your final and very, very detailed audit report." For the next month, I lived in a state of quiet, suspended animation. I went about my life, my daily routines, my grief. But beneath the surface, I was a woman at war, a general in a quiet, secret campaign, waiting for the perfect moment to launch my counterattack. The invitation arrived as I knew it would, in a thick, cream-colored envelope, addressed in a flowing, calligraphic script. It was a summons disguised as a social nicety. "Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Hayes request the pleasure of your company at a housewarming celebration for Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Hayes." The wording was a masterpiece of social climbing. She was not just throwing a party, she was hosting a celebration for her in-laws. She was presenting the house not as her own acquisition, but as a selfless, noble gift to her husband's family. It was a performance of such profound and deeply fraudulent generosity that it was almost a work of art. The invitation was, of course, a command performance for me. It was not an act of inclusion. It was an act of power. She was summoning me to the scene of her greatest triumph, the very house she had stolen with my good name. She wanted me there as a witness to her success, as a quiet, dowdy, and slightly embarrassing prop in the grand final scene of her play. She wanted me to see the world she had bought and the world she had left me in. I called her to RSVP, my voice a perfect imitation of a slightly overwhelmed but dutiful mother. "Jasmine, darling," I said, "the invitation is just beautiful. A house for your in-laws. How incredibly generous of you and Marcus. Of course I'll be there." "Wonderful, mother," she'd replied, her voice a purr of smug, condescending satisfaction. "It's a black tie affair, by the way. Do you have something appropriate to wear?" The small, final, and deeply unnecessary cruelty of that last question was the only confirmation I needed. I was not just a guest. I was a project. A problem to be managed. "I'm sure I can find something suitable, dear," I had replied, my voice a sweet, gentle thing. I spent the next week preparing not for a party but for a final audit. I met with Charles. We finalized our own documents. We prepared our own final statement. On the evening of the party, I did not wear a new dress. I wore a simple, elegant, and very old black gown, a dress of such quiet, understated quality that it made the trendy, flashy fashions of Jasmine's world look cheap. I was not there to compete. I was there to close the books. The house in Winnetka was a monument to new money. It was a vast, white, and vaguely Mediterranean-style mansion, lit up like a movie premiere. A valet in a crisp uniform took my modest 10-year-old sedan, his expression a mask of professional disdain as he parked it between a Bentley and a Maserati. I walked into a scene of performative high-decibel success. The house was filled with the braying laughter of the North Shore elite. A string quartet was playing in the corner of the cavernous, two-story foyer. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and elaborate, unidentifiable hors d'oeuvres. Jasmine and Marcus stood near the entrance, the triumphant hosts. Jasmine was wearing a shimmering, backless gold dress, her smile a bright, brittle thing. Marcus was at her side, his hand possessively on the small of her back, his expression one of deep, smug satisfaction. They were accepting the gushing praise of their guests, the primary of whom were Marcus's parents, the elder Hayeses. "Jasmine, my dear, you've outdone yourself," the senior Mrs. Hayes was saying, her voice a low, aristocratic purr. "To give us such a gift. It's simply extraordinary." "Nothing is too good for our family, Eleanor," Jasmine replied, her voice a perfect blend of humility and pride. She saw me then as I stood on the periphery, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I was a dissonant note in her perfect symphony, a slightly embarrassing relative from the wrong side of the tracks. She quickly recovered. "Mother," she exclaimed, her voice a little too loud. She glided over and gave me an air kiss. "You made it. I'm so glad you could see the new house." She then steered me towards her in-laws, an act of social duty she was clearly eager to get over with. "Eleanor, Jonathan, you remember my mother, Cynthia." The elder Hayeses looked at me with a polite but complete lack of interest. I was the mother of the woman who had just gifted them a multi-million-dollar home, but in their eyes, I was still just the Helps family. I spent the next hour as an invisible woman. I was a ghost at my own daughter's coronation. I drifted through the rooms of the house my good name had paid for, a silent, observant auditor. I saw the expensive custom-made furniture, the modern art on the walls, the state-of-the-art kitchen. Every single object in this house, every floorboard, every pane of glass, was a fruit of my daughter's crime. A crime against me. The party was a celebration of a lie. And I, the sole keeper of the truth, was the most unwelcome guest of all. The moment of the final and most profound insult came as the party was reaching its crescendo. The string quartet was playing Vivaldi. The champagne was flowing freely. And my son-in-law, Marcus, his face flushed with alcohol and self-satisfaction, was feeling particularly and cruelly magnanimous. He saw me standing alone by the grand sweeping staircase, a quiet, gray-haired woman in a simple black dress, a glass of untouched water in my hand. I was an anomaly in his perfect, glittering world, a small, quiet smudge on his otherwise flawless masterpiece. And he decided, in his arrogance, to address it. He sauntered over, a fresh glass of champagne in his hand, his expression one of amused, condescending curiosity. He looked me up and down, his gaze taking in my simple dress, my quiet demeanor. He then smiled, a slow, lazy and deeply insulting smile. And he asked the question. The one single devastating question that was the culmination of years of his own snobbery and his wife's shame. "How did you get here?" he asked, his voice a low, confidential murmur as if he were sharing a private joke with me. The question was not one of genuine confusion. It was not, "Who drove you?" or "How was the traffic?" It was a profound and existential challenge to my very presence in his world. How did a person like you, a simple working-class woman from Hyde Park, find your way into a place like this, a temple of North Shore wealth and power? It was a question designed to remind me of my place. To remind me that I was an outsider, a tourist, a charity case who had been allowed into the palace for a single evening out of a sense of noblesse oblige. It was a question that was meant to put me and my entire life in a small, insignificant box. I looked at him, at this handsome, arrogant, and deeply foolish man. I looked at his expensive, custom-tailored suit, at the gold watch on his wrist, at the smug, self-satisfied look in his eyes. And I felt not a flicker of anger. I felt only a profound and deeply satisfying sense of pity. He had no idea of the beautiful, brutal irony of his own question. He was asking me how I had gotten into a house that I, in a very real and legal sense, had paid for. He was questioning my right to stand on a foundation that was built upon the bedrock of my own, impeccable and criminally misused credit. I did not answer his question with words. I simply gave him a small, serene and completely unreadable smile. A smile that was about to wipe the smug, condescending look off his face forever. My quiet, enigmatic smile seemed to unnerve him. He had expected a flustered, defensive response, an awkward, mumbled answer. He was not prepared for my calm. "I was just leaving, Marcus," I said, my voice a quiet, conversational thing. "But I am so glad you caught me. I wanted to make sure you and Jasmine received your housewarming gift." His expression shifted from condescending amusement to a kind of greedy, expectant curiosity. "A gift? From the poor, simple mother-in-law? This should be good for a laugh." "A gift, Cynthia?" he said, his voice dripping with a false, magnanimous charm. "You really shouldn't have." "Oh, it's no trouble at all," I replied, my smile never wavering. "In fact, he's just arriving." I then did something that shifted the entire focus of the room. I raised my hand, a small, elegant gesture, and I pointed with a single steady finger towards the grand two-story foyer. As if on cue, the massive, ornate front door of the mansion swung open. And standing in the doorway were two men. The first was my lawyer, Charles Dubois. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, a handsome leather briefcase in his hand. He looked formal, imposing, and completely, utterly out of place at a cheerful, celebratory housewarming party. But it was the man standing beside him who brought the entire glittering, noisy party to a dead, silent halt. The second man was wearing the crisp, official and deeply, unmistakably intimidating uniform of a Cook County Sheriff's deputy. The string quartet faltered, a single, discordant violin note hanging in the air. The braying laughter died in people's throats. The clinking of champagne glasses stopped. A profound and deeply shocked silence fell over the entire room. 100 pairs of eyes, the eyes of the North Shore elite, turned from the hosts, from the food, from each other, and fixed upon the two men standing in the doorway. The arrival of a lawyer and a uniformed police officer at a private party is not a social call. It is an event. It is a sign that the carefully constructed facade of a perfect life is about to be publicly and catastrophically ripped away. My housewarming gift had arrived, and it was about to be served. The two men in the doorway did not hesitate. They moved with a quiet, official purpose that was more intimidating than any shouting could have been. Charles, my lawyer, his face a mask of grim professional neutrality, scanned the room, his eyes quickly finding Jasmine and Marcus, who were standing frozen like statues in the center of their own party. The sheriff's deputy, a tall, imposing man with a stone-cold expression, moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his hand resting casually on his hip. He was not here to make an arrest. He was here as a legal witness, an officer of the court, a symbol of the undeniable and very serious authority that was about to be brought to bear. They walked side by side through the stunned, silent crowd of guests. The guests parted before them like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and a delicious, horrified glee. The party was over. The real entertainment was just beginning. I watched from my quiet vantage point by the staircase, as the two men made their way across the marble floor. I watched my daughter Jasmine. Her face, which had been flushed with triumph, had gone a pale, sickly white. Her mind, her sharp lawyer's mind, was clearly racing, trying to process this impossible, unthinkable turn of events. A lawyer. Here. No. It made no sense. I watched my son-in-law Marcus. His smug, condescending smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. His arrogance was a thin, fragile thing, and it had been instantly shattered by the appearance of a man with a badge. Charles and the deputy did not stop until they were standing directly in front of my daughter and her husband. The four of them formed a small, tense island in the center of a vast, silent sea of onlookers. The deputy was the one who spoke first, his voice a calm, professional, and utterly impersonal monotone that carried through the silent room. "Are you Jasmine Coleman Hayes and Marcus Hayes?" he asked, though it was not a question. Jasmine could only nod, her throat suddenly too dry to speak. "You have been served," the deputy said. He then took a thick, legal-sized envelope from Charles's briefcase and held it out to her. The entire sordid and deeply personal family drama had just been transformed into a formal, public, and very, very serious legal proceeding. The act of being served with legal papers is a ritual of public shaming. It is a formal legal announcement that your private life is now a matter of public record, a matter for the courts. And to have it happen in the middle of your own triumphant housewarming party, in front of the very people you are most desperate to impress, is a level of social annihilation that is almost biblical. Jasmine stared at the envelope in the deputy's outstretched hand as if it were a venomous snake. She did not move. She seemed to be paralyzed by a mixture of fear and a dawning, catastrophic understanding. It was Charles who finally broke the silence. His voice was not loud, but it was filled with a cold, clear, and unmistakable authority that cut through the silence of the room. "Jasmine and Marcus Hayes," he said, his voice a formal, public declaration. "You have been served with a notice regarding a criminal complaint filed this morning with the Cook County District Attorney's Office." Criminal complaint. The words, so ugly, so brutal, so final, landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the crowd of horrified, fascinated guests. This was not a civil matter. This was not a lawsuit. This was a crime. Jasmine finally, with a trembling hand, took the envelope from the deputy. Her fingers fumbled with the flap, her usual elegant composure completely gone. She ripped it open, her movements clumsy, frantic. She pulled out the documents, and the entire sordid and deeply secret story of her betrayal was laid bare, in black and white for the entire world to see. Or at least for her to see as the world watched her. The document in Jasmine's trembling hands was not a simple lawsuit. It was a formal notice of asset seizure and criminal complaint. It was a legal bomb, and it detonated in the center of her perfect, fraudulent life. The first page was a summary of the criminal complaints that Charles, on my behalf, had filed with the district attorney's office that very morning. The charges were stark, brutal, and federal. Bank fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft. Each charge carried a potential sentence of years in a federal prison. Attached to the summary were the exhibits. The evidence. My meticulous auditor's case against my own child. There was a certified copy of the fraudulent $900,000 mortgage application. There was a sworn affidavit from me, attesting to the theft of my personal documents. There was a forensic analysis of the digital signatures, proving they were forgeries. And there was the transcript of a recorded conversation with the bank's fraud department. A conversation in which I, the real Cynthia Coleman, had formally disavowed the entire transaction. The evidence was overwhelming. It was irrefutable. It was a perfect airtight case, built with a quiet, patient, and deeply personal fury. But the final document was the one that made her face and her husband's turn a ghastly, chalky, and utterly bloodless white. It was an emergency court order, signed by a judge just hours before. It was a temporary lien and asset seizure notice. It stated that, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, a freeze was to be placed on all known assets of Jasmine Coleman Hayes and Marcus Hayes. Their own home, their bank accounts, their investment portfolios, everything. The beautiful multi-million-dollar house they were standing in, the house that was the entire reason for their crime, was now a crime scene. The life of luxury they had been so proud of had just been, with the stroke of a judge's pen, frozen in place. Jasmine stared at the papers, her mind, her sharp lawyer's mind, finally processing the full catastrophic scale of her own miscalculation. She had not just been caught. She had been annihilated. She had tried to steal her mother's future, and in doing so she had just forfeited her own. She was facing not just financial ruin, but the very real, very terrifying prospect of a federal prison sentence. She looked up from the papers, her eyes wild with a new, unfamiliar emotion. It was not arrogance. It was not contempt. It was fear. Pure, primal, and deeply, deeply deserved. Her pale face was a testament to the brutal, simple, and unforgiving truth of the world I came from. The world of numbers. The world of consequences. The books at long last had been balanced. I did not stay to watch the fallout. My work was done. The final audit report had been delivered. While the entire party was frozen in a state of horrified, fascinated silence, while my daughter and her husband were staring at the wreckage of their own lives, I simply and quietly walked away. I slipped through the crowd of stunned, whispering guests. No one noticed me. I was once again the invisible woman. But this time, my invisibility was not a sign of my weakness but of my strength. I was the quiet, unseen force that had just brought this entire, glittering, fraudulent world to its knees. I walked out the grand front door into the cool, clear air of the Chicago night. I did not need a valet to bring me my car. I had taken a taxi. I was, as I had always been, a woman who preferred to be in control of her own transportation. The weeks that followed were a quiet, legal epilogue to the dramatic events of that night. Jasmine and Marcus, faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence against them, had no choice but to cooperate. Their high-powered lawyers, faced with a case that was a prosecutor's dream, immediately began to negotiate a plea deal. The house in Winnetka, the grand prize of their criminal enterprise, was sold in a court-ordered sale to pay back the fraudulent mortgage. The Hayes family, horrified by the public scandal and the criminal charges, cut them off completely. In the end, Jasmine, to avoid a long prison sentence, pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest and 5 years of probation. She was disbarred. Her career, her reputation, her entire carefully constructed identity was gone. I did not attend her sentencing. I did not need to. My justice had been served that night at the party. The final scene of my story takes place not in a courtroom, but in my own quiet, peaceful brownstone in Hyde Park. I am in my study, surrounded by my books, the quiet, loyal companions of my life. I am meeting with a young woman, a brilliant, ambitious student from the University of Chicago's law school. She is the first recipient of the new scholarship I have just endowed. The Coleman Family Scholarship for Ethics in Law. I have taken the pain of my daughter's betrayal and I have transformed it into a legacy of integrity. I have taken the ugliest chapter of my life and I have used it to write a new and better story for someone else. My name is Cynthia Coleman. I am a retired auditor. And I have learned that the most important audits are not the ones you conduct on other people's finances, but the ones you conduct on your own life. You must account for every asset, every liability. You must be honest about the numbers. And you must, when you find a profound and unforgivable discrepancy, have the courage to correct it. The books at long last are closed. And my own personal ledger is, for the first time in a very long time, perfectly and peacefully balanced.